we will also would like to hear about your experience and your role as an ambassador for the Stanford
Mhm.
Longevity Center. Yeah.
So in that sense, it's a voluntary role for Stanford University, but our role as ambassadors is to really promote the thinking and the research that Stanford's doing around longevity. And I have taken one particular aspect of their work, which is, how do we change workforces to embrace longevity? So
Mhm.
in other words, how do we encourage and build the business case for why it makes sense to hang on to your experienced workers? I don't even like to call them older workers. I call them experienced workers. What's the business case for hanging on to them or even hiring experienced workers? And why the business case that I find has resonated most is when I say to companies, if you don't have a longevity strategy, you don't have a growth strategy.
Mm.
Because workforces are shrinking with declining birth rates. We haven't got that stream of young people coming in to fill the workforce, and we've got a skills shortage. So it really makes sense to hang on to these more experienced workers. And there's some studies that have been done in the UK where if we could encourage people to work just 1 or 2 years longer, that would have a material impact on the gross domestic product of the UK. So it would make our economy grow as well. So it's a virtuous circle. We can get growth in the economy, help our GDP, and we can help growth within the organizations. And it's much easier for people to work longer in order to fund the time when they're not working than it is to save enough, because most people have not saved enough. That's the trouble, because they weren't expecting life expectancy to go on. So it's much easier to work longer to fill that gap, because the savings probably, and certainly the pension, won't actually do it.
What do you think it's the main obstacle for companies, for other companies to see this potential? Why other companies don't do that?
No, it really baffles me. I think ageism is absolutely rife. I do actually think that, even though it's kind of, it's banned, but I think ageism is so unconscious. How many times have I found myself even saying, "Oh, she looks good for her age"? I mean, that's a terrible thing to say. But unconsciously we do this. So I think ageism is rife. I do actually think that a lot of people just feel that the younger generation, should come first and it's their turn. And I don't disagree with that. But I think people are unaware of the demographics. And I think when you really take them through in detail the demographics, how in certain countries, for example, France, Italy, Germany, Japan, even China, they're in danger of population collapse within the next 100 years because of the declining birth rate. Then when people really understand that and you articulate and show them the data, I think then it begins to make sense. I think the other thing that gets in the way is that, unfortunately, a lot of companies are very short term. They've got their quarterly earnings, they've got to report to shareholders. And I think that really longer term perspective, a lot of them, don't embrace. So that's why I think going in with the message of, you're missing out on this $15 trillion silver market if by not paying attention to longevity. And you're also setting yourself up for real issues with your workforce strategies if you don't actually focus on hanging on to your older workers. And therefore, you have to have a growth strategy. You need to have a longevity strategy. That then tends to get people to take a little bit more interest.
Qual é o grande desafio dela ter trabalhado em grandes companhias e agora esse desafio da própria empregabilidade 50 mais, como ela vê o desafio das gerações trabalharem juntas e como as empresas estão encarando isso fora, né? Porque aqui no Brasil a gente está começando e tem grandes barreiras.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I interviewed Professor Linda Grattan, who is she is the professor of management practice at London Business School, and she is an expert on the future of work. And I asked her this very question, And she said at London Business School, they refuse to categorize people through generations because they find it's meaningless. That what a 20-year-old wants today is what a 20-year-old wants, and that's very different from a 50-year-old. It's not because it's Gen X or Gen Y or Gen Z, it's just that they're at a different life stage. And actually, life stages is a much better way of looking at it than categorizing people into these kind of different kind of names for different generations. So what a 20-year-old wants from their career will be different from what somebody wants from 50. However, in my experience, because I've worked in the corporate world for 40 odd years, and I stayed in the corporate world until my early 60s, and I did work with much younger people coming out of university in their 20s. What I find is that there is a very different kind of intelligence. So young people tend to have, that fluid intelligence, that street smarts, that innovation that's kind of not hampered by being told, well, you can't do that, you can't do that. They've just got really great ideas. They may not be so practical, but they're great, innovative, new ways of looking at things. Whereas more experienced people tend to have wisdom, experience, a crystallized intelligence. And when you bring those two together, that's when I think you can get real magic. And so that's why I think bringing them together really makes sense. But they do come at things from a very different perspective. There's some evidence to show that, the way people like to be communicated with is different. So again, slightly more experienced workers will, prefer to go across the room and talk to somebody and have face-to-face. Whereas it seems that some of the younger generations, particularly post-COVID, feel they much rather send an email, even if it's someone sitting across the desk from them. So I think communication styles can be different. But I think the needs of 20-year-olds are probably very similar to the needs of 20-year-olds, of all 20-year-olds have always ever been. And I think there is a danger if we box people too much in categories, because we are all different. But I do think there are some differences in the way that we definitely think about ideas that we can really benefit from by celebrating that difference, if you see what I mean, and then using it.
Qual é o poder da educação nas universidades e nas escolas para que a gente possa ter esse encontro de gerações, uma coisa mais natural no futuro, que a gente não precise educar as empresas, que a gente, qual é o movimento que ela sente, qual é a importância disso?
So there's several aspects to this. So one aspect is that at the moment, life expectancy has more than doubled since the early 1900s, and people can expect to live into their 90s, and people born today will live it to 100. And at the moment, we tack this extra life, these extra 30 odd years to the end of life. They actually need to be woven into people's lives right from the start. And so, people won't do the sort of, be educated, work, retire. It'll be educate, work, take a sabbatical, reskill, go back to university, do a different type of job. It'll be much more stages rather than these three buckets. And I think we need to be teaching young people today that's how their life's going to be. So rather than a career being a sort of sprint, it's more of a marathon, because they can't work at the pace that we did if they're going to be working into their 70s. So I think that's a piece of education that really should be being taught absolutely right now. In education. And I mentor quite a few young people coming out of university, and I tell them not to worry about finding the career. Just do something that piques your interest, try it for a while, you'll learn something, you'll learn what you like and what you don't like. And I think people get too set on about finding the thing. I mean, I'm still finding the thing at 66. My career's changed hugely over the years. So I think there is a real thing. I think the other thing for universities is I think they also have to shift in their business models. They have to become lifelong learning institutes, because again, they're not going to have the number of young people coming in that makes them sustainable. And what's interesting is that a number of universities are now running programs for people who are 50 plus, who are trying to figure out what do they do with this extra life. So Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, I mean, some of the big universities are now doing this. And I think more and more of the universities will shift to become lifelong learning institutes. And if we have this multi-stage approach to life, well, then people will want to go back in and out of education to learn new things and reskill. So it is a great opportunity for them as well.
She also think it's important for the professionals over 50. They can change their mindsets also, not just universities and the companies, because sometimes when they complete 50 or 60, they think, oh, I retire, I'm not useful anymore. So she works a lot with this topic, the mindset change for the professionals. So I don't think I don't know if you work with that on your mentorships, and if you could talk to us a little about that topic.
Yes, so similarly, I do actually coach people who are thinking of leaving full-time careers and wondering what next. So I used to do executive coaching, but I now focus on people in that sort of 50, 60 years group who are thinking of doing that. And it is interesting. I do actually think, ageism is often an internal barrier that we create. I mean, people say to me, oh, I can't get a job. I'm in my 50s and I'd like to work again, but I've been made redundant or I've retired. I can't get anything. Well, that's just not true. I mean, I went back into the corporate world when I was 52. And then I moved out of that job and I went into another bank when I was 61. So it's so not true. We do create these barriers for ourselves, I think. But the other thing too is that, there are so many opportunities, I think, even when you leave your full-time career, to think about doing something that has some purpose. So all the science shows that if you have something that's meaningful to you in your life, that actually is the key to a long and happy lifespan. So there's a woman called Rebecca Levy at Yale University. You've probably heard the study. Yeah, the 7.5 years extra if you have a positive attitude. I mean, amazing. And then Harvard University, their study of adult behavior, which is the longest of its kind. I think it's about a study of humans over 80 years. They have shown that having strong relationships in your life, friends, family, and having something that is really purposeful, rather than wealth or status, is the best indicator of whether you're going to have a happy and long life. And so we can all do things that are meaningful to us. And some people say, oh, but I don't know what my purpose is. Well, a purpose doesn't have to be something with a big capital P. It can be something quite small. And I often say to people, if you're struggling to find something that's really meaningful to you, just do something you love purposefully. So think of it as a verb rather than a noun. And sometimes that's more helpful to people. But if you think about what your strengths and skills are, what are the things that kind of light you up? And then how might you use those to help improve the world, even in a small way? That's all something that we can think about. So I often just help people kind of like think about those parts of their character and their experience, and then think about, well, what do they feel passionately about, or what is it something that maybe agitates them in the world that they might want to help fix, or is it something neglected from childhood, and a neglected passion that they used to do and they had to give up because of work and other commitments? Well, maybe they can come back to that now and do that purposefully. So I think there is all sorts of things, but people just need some help sometimes, as you said, to get into the right frame of mind, the right mindset. But there's so many adventures to be had, at any age. And in many ways, this third chapter, I think, is one of the most exciting, because you can really design it the way you want it to be, not how your parents or the education system or society. You get to decide what you really want to do with this kind of third chapter.
Beautiful. I love Becca Levy. Is the first book, amazing, because I feel it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Completely agree.
How do you see the future with this growing older population and with the generations working together and doing everything together? How do you see this future for the companies and for the world?
A good question. And of course, we don't know because there's no playbook. It's something that's evolving over time. But I do actually think one of the hardest things for organizations is career pathways are going to have to be very, very different than they currently are. So again, if we think about stages, not ages, that I think is going to be a much more fruitful way, because if people are going to have to be working much longer, there is going to have to be much more flexibility in the way that they manage their careers. And in many ways, a woman in her 30s who's got young children, being able to take some time out to be able to kind of focus on childcare isn't very different from somebody in their 50s who may have grown-up children but has elderly parents, and they need some time out to be able to have some flexibility to look after their parents. So they're completely different ages, but they're at similar stages in many ways. So I think workplaces will have to think about how they create workforce strategies and career paths that look at the stages that people are in that life rather than thinking about their particular age. And I think if we do that, that means that the generations will automatically sort of come together in a much more fluid way than perhaps the rather sort of, I don't know, maybe sometimes false way that we're trying to bring them together at the moment. But I personally see a future where it would be great if ageism was just not a feature and we just valued and respected people for the different perspectives that they give, like all aspects of diversity. We all benefit from having those different perspectives, and age is irrelevant, really.
We would like to thank you for your time. It was really rich conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was great to meet you. I really value what you're doing too, because it's great to be able to get this message out, and we just need to. I think that's the most important thing, is getting awareness out much more.